The next morning arrived with ominous storm clouds gathering over the palace. David resumed his cleaning duties, but now every conversation he overheard and every document he glimpsed while dusting desks took on new significance. He was no longer just a servant going through the motions. He was a knight on a secret mission. Alexander had given him a small signal system to use if he discovered anything urgent. David was to adjust the position of certain decorative items in the main hall to indicate whether he had learned something important. It was a simple code, but effective for their purposes. As David worked in the administrative wing of the palace, he noticed an unusual amount of activity around Lord Blackwood's office. Messengers were coming and going frequently, and several nobles were having quick, whispered conversations in the corridors. Something big was clearly being planned. Around midday, David was assigned to clean the royal council chamber in preparation for an emergency meeting. As he worked, he discovered several documents that had been left on the table from a previous gathering. The papers contained detailed information about troop positions, supply routes, and defensive strategies. Exactly the kind of information that could be valuable to enemy forces. David quickly memorized as much as he could before finishing his cleaning. When he returned to the main hall, he adjusted the decorative items according to the signal system he and Alexander had established. Within an hour, Alexander appeared in the main hall, ostensibly touring the palace as part of his official visit. When he saw David's signals, he gave an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. That evening, the brothers met again in the secluded garden. David shared what he had discovered, and Alexander's expression grew grave. "They're planning something. For tomorrow night," Alexander said after David described the documents he had seen. "There's going to be a celebration for the returning military delegation, and it looks like they're using it as cover for some kind of operation." "What kind of operation?" "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I suspect they're planning to eliminate key military leaders who might oppose whatever coup they're organizing. The celebration would be the perfect opportunity. Everyone will be in one place, and security will be focused on protection rather than investigation." David felt a surge of anger as he realized how completely he had been deceived. "Captain, Aldrich has been planning this for years, hasn't he? That's why he kept me close, not to protect me, but to monitor me and make sure I didn't remember anything that could threaten their plans." "It looks that way," Alexander agreed. "But his deception may have given us exactly what we need to stop them." The next day, David continued his servant duties while secretly observing the preparations for the evening's celebration. He noticed that several of the palace guards had been reassigned to different positions and that some unfamiliar faces were among the security detail. It seemed clear that the conspirators were positioning their own people for whatever they had planned. Day, the celebration began. David was assigned to serve refreshments to the guests. This gave him the perfect opportunity to move through the crowd and observe the various nobles and military officers. He could see the tension in Captain Aldrich's face and noticed how Lord Blackwood kept checking a pocket watch as if waiting for a specific time. Alexander, dressed in his formal military uniform, was mingling with the other guests and accepting congratulations for his successful mission. To anyone watching, he appeared relaxed and unsuspecting, but David could see the alertness in his brother's eyes. As the evening progressed, David noticed that several of the military officers were beginning to look unwell. At first, he thought it might be too much wine, but then he realized that something more sinister was happening. The drinks were being poisoned, and the targets were specifically the officers who would be most likely to oppose a coup. David quickly made his way to where Alexander was standing and accidentally bumped into him while serving refreshments. In that moment, he whispered urgently, "The drinks. They're poisoned. Get everyone out." Alexander's training kicked in immediately. Without showing any sign of alarm, he began quietly alerting the loyal officers around him. Within minutes, the poisoned guests were being helped out of the hall, and Alexander's trusted soldiers were surrounding the suspected conspirators. Captain Aldrich realized that their plan had been exposed when he saw the pattern of people leaving the celebration. His hand moved toward his sword, but David was ready for him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," David said calmly, stepping out from behind a pillar with Shadowbane drawn and ready. "After 3 years of cleaning up after your conspiracy, I Think it's time for some accountability." Captain Aldrich's eyes widened in shock as he saw David holding the legendary sword with the skill of a trained knight. "You remember?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief and fear. "I remember everything," David replied, "including how you've been using me to gather intelligence while keeping me under control with lies about my past." The confrontation was swift but decisive. The conspirators, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, surrendered rather than face certain defeat in combat. Lord Blackwood and Captain Aldrich were arrested along with several other nobles who had been working to undermine the kingdom from within. As the dust settled, King Edward himself arrived to assess the situation. When Alexander explained how David's recovered memories and 3 years of observations had made it possible to uncover the conspiracy, the king was amazed. "Sir David Thorne," the king said formally, using his proper title and name for the first time in 3 years, "your service to this kingdom has been extraordinary, both as a knight and as an unwitting spy. I hereby restore you to your full rank and position, with additional honors for your exceptional dedication." David knelt before his king, but this time it was as a recognized knight rather than a humble servant. As he rose, he caught sight of the other palace sentinels who had once looked down on him. Their expressions ranged from amazement to embarrassment as they realized that the cleaner they had mocked was actually a decorated war hero. In the days that followed, David resumed his duties as a knight, but he had been forever changed by his experience. His years as a servant had taught him humility, patience, and the importance of paying attention to details that others might overlook. These qualities made him an even better knight than he had been before his injury. Alexander was proud of his younger brother's courage and resourcefulness. "You saved the kingdom," he told David as they stood together on the palace ramparts, looking out over the lands they had sworn to protect. David smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in 3 years. "I was just doing my duty," he replied. "Whether that duty involved cleaning floors or exposing traitors, it was all in service to the same cause." The mysterious sword Shadowbane hung once again at David's side, where it belonged. The weapon that had helped him remember his true identity would continue to serve him as he faced whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with both the skills of a knight and the wisdom he had gained during his time as a humble palace servant. The next morning, David woke up in his small servants' quarters feeling like a completely different person. The memories were still returning in waves, but he now had a clear sense of who he truly was. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere and had a purpose beyond cleaning floors and organizing supplies. Alexander had told him to continue his regular duties for 1 more day while they arranged the meeting with King Edward. They didn't want to draw unnecessary attention until they were ready to make the official announcement about David's recovered identity. As David went about his morning cleaning routine, he found himself seeing the palace through entirely new eyes. Details that he had overlooked as a servant now seemed significant. He noticed how certain nobles would stop their conversations when servants approached, and how some of the palace guards seemed unusually nervous around the visiting military delegation. During his lunch break, David overheard a conversation between 2 nobles that made him pause. They were discussing the recent military campaign in hushed tones, expressing disappointment that General Thorne's mission had been successful. One of them mentioned that certain arrangements would need to be adjusted now that the northern threat had been eliminated. David pretended to continue eating his simple meal while listening carefully. The nobles were clearly upset that Alexander's forces had won their battles, which seemed like a strange reaction for loyal citizens of the kingdom. When they noticed him nearby, they immediately changed the subject to safer topics like the weather and upcoming festivals. Later that afternoon, while cleaning the corridors near the royal offices, David witnessed something even more suspicious. Captain Aldrich was meeting privately with Lord Blackwood, one of the king's senior advisors. Through a partially open door, David could see them examining what appeared to be military maps and documents. "The general's return has complicated things significantly," Lord Blackwood was saying. "We'll need to accelerate our timeline if we want to proceed with the plan." Captain Aldrich nodded grimly. "I've been keeping the boy busy with meaningless tasks, but if his memories return, he could become a serious problem. He's seen and heard too much over the past 3 years. David felt his blood turn cold as he realized they were talking about him. Not only was Captain Aldrich involved in whatever conspiracy was unfolding, but his decision to keep David as a servant hadn't been purely protective. It had been a way to keep him under control and unaware of his true significance. David quickly moved away from the door before he could be discovered, but his mind was racing. If Captain Aldrich was working against the kingdom, then everything about David's life for the past 3 years had been a carefully constructed lie. The captain hadn't been protecting him. He had been keeping him close to monitor him and ensure he didn't remember anything important. That evening, David met Alexander in a secluded garden behind the palace. He quickly shared what he had overheard, and Alexander's expression grew increasingly serious as he listened. "I had suspected that someone close to the king was involved," Alexander said, "but I didn't realize that Captain Aldrich was part of it. This explains how our enemies knew so much about our military movements." "What do we do now?" David asked. "If we reveal my true identity tomorrow, won't that put us in even more danger?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through their options. "Actually, it might be our best chance to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. If they think you're still just a confused servant with no memories, they won't be as careful around you." "You want me to continue pretending to be Marcus?" "For now, yes, but we need to be very careful. If they suspect that your memories are returning, they might try to eliminate you before you can expose them." David felt a chill at his brother's words, but he also felt a surge of determination. For 3 years he had been treated as someone insignificant, someone who didn't matter. Now he had a chance to use that perceived weakness as a strength. "I can do it," David said firmly. "I've been playing the role of a humble servant for 3 years. I can keep doing it a little longer if it helps save the kingdom." Alexander smiled, with pride at his younger brother's courage. "Just remember, you're not the same person you were 3 years ago. You've learned things and developed skills during your time here that you didn't have before. Use those advantages." As they finalized their plan, neither brother noticed the shadowy figure watching them from an upper window of the palace. Lord Blackwood had grown suspicious when General Thorne had requested a private tour of the palace, and he had been keeping careful watch over the famous general's activities. The conspiracy that David and Alexander were trying to uncover was much larger and more dangerous than they realized, and their enemies were already taking steps to protect themselves. The next few days would test not only David's ability to maintain his disguise, but also both brothers' skills as warriors and strategists. The game of deception was about to become deadly, and David would soon discover that his years as a palace servant had prepared him for challenges that his original training as a knight never could have anticipated. The humble cleaner was about to become the kingdom's most valuable secret weapon, but only if he could survive long enough to use what he had learned. Tomorrow would bring the most dangerous performance of David's life, as he continued to play the role of Marcus while secretly gathering the evidence needed to expose the traitors who had been operating within the very heart of the kingdom's power. Alexander reached into his uniform and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I brought something that might help your memories return," he said softly, opening the pouch to reveal a silver pendant on a chain. The pendant bore the same coat of arms that was engraved on Shadowbane. As soon as David saw the pendant, a flood of memories crashed over him like a breaking dam. He saw himself as a young boy, receiving the pendant from their father on his 16th birthday. He remembered their childhood home, not a humble farm, but a noble estate with vast training grounds and stables. He remembered their parents, Lord William Thorne, a respected general who had died in battle when David was 17, and Lady Margaret, their kind mother who had passed away from illness 2 years later. He remembered how Alexander, being 5 years older, had taken responsibility for David's training and education after their parents' deaths. "The Battle of Raven's Ridge," David whispered, the memories becoming clearer. "I was your aide. We were ambushed by enemy forces while carrying important messages to the northern outposts." Alexander nodded, his eyes showing both relief and sadness. "You were struck by a mace while protecting the dispatches. The healers said you might never wake up, but you did." When I returned from pursuing the enemy soldiers, you were gone. The healers assumed you had wandered off in confusion from your head injury. David touched his forehead where he had always wondered about a small scar that he couldn't remember getting. I remember fragments now, being in a tent, feeling confused and frightened. Everything seemed strange and unfamiliar. You probably panicked when you couldn't remember who you were or where you belonged, Alexander explained. It's common with serious head injuries. You must have walked for days before Captain Aldrich found you. As the truth settled in, David felt a mixture of emotions. There was relief at finally understanding his true identity, but also sadness for the 3 years he had lost living as someone else. He thought about all the menial tasks he had performed, the way the other palace guards had treated him, and how he had accepted it all because he thought it was what he deserved. "Why didn't Captain Aldrich tell me the truth when you arrived?" David asked. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "I suspect he wanted to be certain that your memories were truly returning before he said anything. Head injuries can be unpredictable, and false hope can sometimes make things worse. He's actually been quite protective of you, in his own way." David realized that this was true. While Captain Aldrich had given him humble duties, he had also kept him safe and provided him with steady work when he had nowhere else to go. The captain had even trusted him with keys to important areas of the palace, something that wouldn't have been done if he hadn't seen potential in him. "What happens now?" David asked, looking down at Shadowbane. "I'm not the same person I was before the injury. I've been living as a servant for 3 years. The other palace guards barely respect me. That's about to change very quickly," Alexander said with a slight smile. "Tomorrow morning I'm going to speak with King Edward about your true identity. Once the king learns that you're alive, and that your memories are returning, you'll be restored to your proper rank and position." David felt a surge of anxiety. "But I don't know if I remember enough about being a knight. What if I've forgotten too much about combat and strategy? The sword forms you were practicing when I found you were flawless," Alexander observed. "Your body remembers even if your mind doesn't fully recall everything yet. The training will come back to you gradually, especially now that you know who you really are." As they talked, David began to remember more details about his previous life. He recalled specific battles he had participated in, friends he had served alongside, and the sense of purpose he had felt as a knight in service to the kingdom. It was like putting together pieces of a puzzle that he hadn't even known was incomplete. "There's something else you should know," Alexander said, his tone becoming more serious. "The mission that brought me back to the palace wasn't entirely successful. We defeated the enemy force that was threatening the northern borders, but we believe they were working for someone here in the kingdom. There may be traitors among the nobles, or even within the palace itself." David felt a chill run down his spine. "You think someone here is working against the kingdom?" "I'm almost certain of it," Alexander replied. "The enemy forces knew too much about our troop movements and defensive positions. Someone with access to military information has been passing secrets to our enemies." This revelation made David realize that his years as a palace servant might actually prove useful. "I've been cleaning and organizing all over the palace for 3 years, he said slowly. "I've overheard countless conversations and seen documents that people probably assumed a servant wouldn't understand." Alexander's eyes lit up with interest. "That could be incredibly valuable. You've had access to areas and information that even high-ranking visitors wouldn't see. If there are traitors in the palace, you might have witnessed something important without realizing it." As dawn began to break over the palace, the two brothers continued to discuss David's recovered memories and what he might have observed during his time as a servant. Neither of them realized that someone had been listening outside the armory door, and that their conversation had been overheard by the very person they were trying to uncover. The game of deception that had been playing out in the palace for months was about to reach a dangerous new level, and David's restoration to his true identity would put both brothers directly in the path of enemies they had not yet identified. As darkness settled over the palace, Marcus made his way quietly toward the armory. The corridors were dimly lit by torches, and most of the celebration activities had moved to the royal dining halls. This was his chance to examine the mysterious sword without interruption. The armory was located in the lower levels of the palace away from the main living areas. Marcus had spent countless hours here over the past 3 years, cleaning and organizing weapons, but he had never felt the kind of nervous anticipation that gripped him now. He unlocked the heavy wooden door with the key that Captain Aldrich had trusted him with, one of the few responsibilities he had been given. The room was filled with rows of swords, spears, shields, and armor, all meticulously maintained and organized. Moonlight streamed through a small window, casting eerie shadows across the metal surfaces. Marcus moved quickly to the corner where he had discovered the unusual sword. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the weapon, and when his fingers closed around the handle, the same strange sensation washed over him. It was as if the sword recognized him somehow. This time, instead of putting it back immediately, Marcus took the sword to the center of the room where the moonlight was strongest. He could see the intricate engravings more clearly now. They depicted scenes of battle and victory, with a coat of arms that seemed familiar, but which he couldn't quite identify. As he held the weapon, more memories began to surface. He remembered learning specific sword techniques, ones that were far more advanced than anything the palace sentinels were taught. He could almost hear a voice giving him instructions. Keep your stance wide. Focus on your breathing. Let the blade be an extension of your arm. Marcus found himself moving through combat forms that he didn't consciously remember learning. The sword felt perfectly balanced in his hands, and his body seemed to know exactly how to use it. For several minutes, he practiced the movements, each one feeling more natural than the last. Suddenly he heard footsteps approaching the armory. Panic shot through him as he realized how much trouble he would be in if he were caught with the weapon. Palace servants weren't allowed to handle military equipment, especially not mysterious swords that didn't seem to belong to the standard inventory. Marcus quickly moved to return the sword to its hiding place, but the footsteps stopped right outside the armory door. Someone was standing there, apparently listening. Marcus held his breath and remained perfectly still, hoping that whoever it was would move on. After what felt like an eternity, he heard a key turning in the lock. The door opened slowly, and a tall figure stepped into the moonlit room. Marcus's heart nearly stopped when he recognized the silhouette. It was clearly a military officer, based on the uniform and bearing. "I know you're in here," a deep voice said calmly. "There's no need to hide." Marcus remained frozen behind a row of armor stands, still clutching the mysterious sword. The officer stepped further into the room, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. When the moonlight fell across his face, Marcus could see that this was indeed one of the visiting military leaders from the delegation. "The question is," the officer continued, "what are you doing with Shadowbane?" Marcus felt his blood turn cold. The officer knew about the sword, and apparently knew its name. But how could that be possible when Marcus had found it hidden, away like a forgotten relic? "Come out," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've been looking for both you and that sword for a very long time." With no other choice, Marcus stepped out from behind the armor stands. The moonlight revealed his palace servant uniform and his nervous expression, but the officer didn't seem surprised. Instead, there was something almost like relief in his eyes. "You don't remember me, do you?" the officer asked, studying Marcus's face carefully. Marcus shook his head, though something about the man's voice continued to tug at his memory. "I'm sorry, sir, I'm just a palace cleaner. I wasn't supposed to touch the sword, I was only—" "Your name isn't Marcus," the officer interrupted gently. "And you're not a palace cleaner. Your real name is David Thorne, and you're my younger brother." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, nearly dropping the sword. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I don't have a brother. My family are farmers. I've been working here for 3 years. The officer, who Marcus now realized must be General Alexander Thorne himself, took a step closer. 3 years ago, you were injured in a battle while serving as my aide. You suffered a severe head wound that caused you to lose your memories. When you disappeared from the medical tent, I thought you had died. I've been searching for you ever since." Marcus's mind was reeling. "But Captain Aldrich said I came from a farming family. He said I was lucky to get this position." "Captain Aldrich found you wandering the countryside with no memory of who you were. Alexander explained. "He created the story about your background to give you a place in the palace. I suspect he was hoping your memories would return eventually, but when they didn't, he kept you here as a servant to keep you safe." The mysterious sword suddenly felt incredibly heavy in Marcus's hands. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his past, about his identity was crumbling around him, yet somehow deep inside he felt that his brother was telling the truth. "The sword recognized you because it was yours," Alexander continued. "Shadowbane was forged specifically for you when you completed your training as a knight. You were one of the most promising young warriors I had ever seen." Marcus, or David, looked down at the weapon with new understanding. That was why it had felt so familiar, why his body seemed to know how to use it. This wasn't just any sword. It was his sword, made for him in what felt like another lifetime. The next morning arrived with a flurry of activity that Marcus had never seen before in the palace. Royal trumpets announced the arrival of the military delegation, and every servant, guard, and noble seemed to be rushing to catch a glimpse of the returning heroes. Marcus was assigned his usual morning task of cleaning the great hall where the formal reception would take place. As he polished the floors and dusted the ornate furniture, he could hear the sound of horses and carriages approaching the palace gates. The excitement in the air was almost tangible. "Make sure everything is spotless," Captain Aldrich barked at Marcus as he passed by. "These are important guests, and we can't have any embarrassment in front of them." Marcus worked quickly, trying to finish his duties before the ceremony began. He wanted to at least catch a glimpse of these legendary warriors that everyone was talking about. From the snippets of conversation he overheard, it seemed that the returning delegation had completed some kind of crucial mission that had saved the kingdom from a great threat. As the morning progressed, Marcus noticed that the palace staff were all talking about one particular officer who was leading the delegation. They spoke of him with a mixture of awe and reverence, describing him as one of the most skilled warriors the kingdom had ever produced. Some of the older servants seemed to recognize the name, though Marcus couldn't quite make out what they were saying. When the great hall was finally ready, Marcus was ordered to move to the corridors to continue cleaning while the ceremony took place. He felt disappointed, but not surprised. This was exactly what he had expected. The important events always happened without him. As he worked in a nearby hallway, Marcus could hear the sound of the great doors opening and the formal announcements beginning. The voice of the royal herald echoed through the palace as he introduced each member of the returning delegation. Marcus tried to listen while continuing to dust the wall decorations, presenting Sir Edmund of Westmarch, Knight of the Silver Order, presenting Lady Catherine Blackwood, Defender of the Northern Borders. The names continued, each one accompanied by cheers and applause from the assembled crowd. Marcus found himself getting caught up in the excitement despite being excluded from the actual event. Then he heard a name that made him freeze in place, presenting General Alexander Thorne, hero of the Battle of Dragon's Pass, protector of the realm. The name hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. Somewhere deep in his mind, memories began to stir. He had heard that name before, but not in the palace. The memories were fuzzy and incomplete, like trying to remember a dream, but they were definitely there. Images flashed through his mind. A man in gleaming armor, teaching him sword techniques in a training yard. The same voice calling his name, but not Marcus. Something else entirely. A feeling of safety and protection that he hadn't experienced since coming to the palace. Marcus dropped his cleaning cloth and pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. The memories were becoming stronger and more vivid. He remembered being younger, maybe 12 or 13 years old, and spending long hours learning combat skills from someone who cared about his progress. But why couldn't he remember more clearly? And why did the name Alexander Thorne feel so important to him? Inside the great hall, the ceremony was reaching its climax. Marcus could hear King Edward speaking, praising the delegation for their service to the kingdom. The crowd was cheering loudly, and there seemed to be some kind of special recognition being given to General Thorne. As the applause died down, Marcus heard footsteps approaching the hallway where he was standing. He quickly picked up his cleaning. supplies and tried to look busy, but his mind was still reeling from the strange memories that had surfaced. A group of palace officials walked past, discussing the ceremony in excited tones. One of them mentioned that General Thorne had specifically requested to tour the entire palace, including areas that weren't normally shown to visiting dignitaries. Apparently, he was looking for someone or something, though he hadn't explained what. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. Could the general be looking for him? But that seemed impossible. Why would such an important military leader be interested in a lowly palace cleaner? Still, the timing of these recovered memories seemed too coincidental to ignore. As the day wore on, Marcus found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work. Every sound in the corridor made him look up, expecting to see the famous general walking toward him. But the hours passed quietly, and gradually Marcus began to think that his hopes were just wishful thinking. That evening, as he was putting away his cleaning supplies, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going to return to the armory and take another look at the mysterious sword he had found the day before. Something told him that the weapon was connected to his recovered memories and to General Alexander Thorne. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he scrubbed the marble floors of the royal palace. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the pristine hallways. For 3 years, he had been working as a royal sentinel, but lately his duties seemed more like those of a janitor than a guard. The other sentinels often laughed at him behind his back. They called him the cleaner because Captain Aldrich always assigned him the most mundane tasks. While his fellow guards patrolled the important areas of the palace or stood watch at ceremonial events, Marcus found himself mopping floors, polishing armor, and organizing supply rooms. "Marcus!" Captain Aldrich's voice echoed through the corridor. "When you're done with that floor, I need you to clean the armory. Some of the weapons are getting dusty." Marcus nodded without looking up. He had learned not to complain or ask questions. Every time he did, Captain Aldrich would remind him that he was lucky to even be a sentinel at all. Marcus came from a poor, farming family outside the kingdom, and getting this position had been the opportunity of a lifetime. He couldn't afford to lose it. As he worked, Marcus often wondered what his life would have been like if he had been born into nobility like some of the other guards. They seemed to glide through their duties with confidence and respect. Meanwhile, he scrubbed and cleaned, invisible to most of the palace staff. The other sentinels would sometimes share stories of their exciting encounters and important missions during their lunch breaks. Marcus would listen quietly, eating his simple meal in the corner. He dreamed of the day when he might be trusted with real guard duties, when he could prove that he was more than just someone who cleaned up after others. That afternoon, while organizing the weapon storage room, Marcus found an old sword tucked away in a dusty corner. It was different from the standard royal weapons, heavier with intricate engravings along the blade. The metal seemed to shimmer with an unusual quality, and the handle felt perfectly balanced in his grip. He had never seen this particular weapon before, despite spending countless hours cleaning and organizing the armory. Something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't explain why. As he held it, memories seemed to stir in the back of his mind, fragments of training sessions and combat techniques that he didn't remember learning. Marcus quickly put the sword back where he found it and continued with his work. But throughout the rest of the day, he couldn't stop thinking about the weapon. There was something special about it, something that made his heart race with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. Little did he know that this discovery would soon change everything about his humble life as a palace cleaner. That evening, as Marcus finished his final chores for the day, he noticed unusual activity in the palace. Royal messengers were running through the corridors with urgent expressions. Guards were being stationed at every entrance, and there was a tension in the air that made everyone speak in hushed whispers. Word quickly spread among the staff that an important military delegation was returning from a long mission. The soldiers had been away for months, and their return was completely unexpected. No one knew exactly who was coming or why their arrival had caused such a commotion among the palace officials. Marcus gathered his cleaning supplies and headed toward the servants' quarters, trying to stay out of the way of the bustling activity. As he walked through the main hall, He caught glimpses of nobles and high-ranking officers preparing for some kind of formal reception. He couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and longing as he watched the preparations. These were the kinds of important events that real guards got to participate in. Meanwhile, he would probably spend the evening cleaning up after the celebration, invisible as always. As Marcus reached his small room, he found himself thinking once again about the mysterious sword he had discovered. Something told him that tomorrow would be different, though he had no idea just how dramatically his life was about to change. The palace settled into an expectant silence as night fell, with everyone waiting for the arrival of the mysterious military delegation. Marcus lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of heroes would be returning to the kingdom. He had no way of knowing that one of those returning officers held the key to his forgotten past and his true identity.